Chapter 1 The kingdom of Eldermere was a vast and quiet land, where the winds whispered through the endless fields of barley and the peasants toiled from dawn till dusk without complaint or fanfare. The ruler, King Aldric the Unremarkable, was a man of such middling stature and forgettable demeanor that even his own courtiers often struggled to recall his name during official ceremonies. The days in Eldermere passed with a sluggish rhythm, each one indistinguishable from the last, as the ministers droned on about crop yields and taxation disputes in meetings that stretched for hours without resolution. The castle itself was a grey, sprawling structure with no particular architectural charm, its halls lined with tapestries so faded by time that their original designs were lost to memory. In the village below, the blacksmith hammered the same piece of metal day after day, never quite finishing whatever he was working on, while the baker produced loaves of bread that were neither too soft nor too hard, entirely devoid of any distinguishing flavor. The most exciting event in recent memory had been a minor dispute over a missing chicken, which was resolved when the bird wandered back into its co-op of its own accord 3 days later. The soldiers of the realm, clad in rusting armor, practiced the drills with half-hearted enthusiasm, knowing full well that no war had touched Eldermere in generations, and none was likely to arise in the foreseeable future. Chapter 2 The neighboring kingdom of Duskhaven was much the same, ruled by Queen Maribel the Taciturn, a woman who spoke so rarely that her advisers had grown accustomed to making decisions based on her faint nods or subtle sighs rather than actual words. The trade agreements between Eldermere and Duskhaven were so meticulously dull that even the scribes tasked with recording them often dozed off mid-sentence, their quills slipping from their fingers as they succumbed to the sheer tedium of the proceedings. The roads connecting the two realms were poorly maintained, with weeds growing between the cobblestones and the occasional broken cartwheel left to rot where it had been abandoned years prior. Merchants traveled these routes out of habit rather than necessity, their wagons filled with goods of such little value that bandits couldn't be bothered to waylay them. In the Duskhaven archives, a single clerk spent his days cataloguing grain receipts from decades past, a task so devoid of urgency that he often paused for hours at a time to stare blankly at the wall, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply stopped altogether. The Queen's annual banquet was an event met with resigned sighs by the nobility, who knew they would be served lukewarm soup, overcooked mutton, and a dessert so bland that it was impossible to tell whether it was meant to be a pudding or a cake. Chapter 3 Beyond these two kingdoms lay the Whispering Plains, an expanse of land so featureless that travelers often lost all sense of direction within minutes of entering, wandering in circles until they either stumbled back the way they came or simply gave up and sat down to wait for nightfall. The grass here was neither lush nor sparse, the soil neither fertile nor barren, and the few animals that inhabited the region moved with such lethargy that they seemed barely alive. A lone hermit named Brother Thaddeus had once attempted to build a monastery in the heart of the plains, but after years of solitude, even he had forgotten the purpose of his mission and now spent his days counting pebbles and muttering to himself about the weather. Occasionally, a lost merchant or a wayward shepherd would cross paths with him, but the conversations were brief and forgettable, usually consisting of vague remarks about the lack of rain or the sameness of the landscape before both parties lapsed into silence once more. The only notable landmark in the Whispering Plains was a single, gnarled tree that had somehow survived for centuries despite bearing no fruit and providing no shade, its twisted branches creaking softly in the wind as if murmuring secrets to no one in particular. Chapter 4 Back in Eldermere, the court historian, a man named Reginald the Verbose, had been laboring for 37 years on a comprehensive chronicle of the kingdom's past, a task made nearly impossible by the sheer lack of noteworthy events to document. He filled entire volumes with descriptions of minor administrative changes, the lineage of undistinguished noble families, and exhaustive accounts of harvest festivals where nothing of interest had occurred. His latest chapter, which had taken him 6 months to compose, was a 20,000-word analysis of a tax reform so insignificant that even the treasurer who had implemented it had forgotten about it within a year. Reginald's quill scratched across the parchment day after day, his prose growing increasingly convoluted as he struggled to stretch thin material into something resembling a narrative. The few scholars who attempted to read his work found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer weight of unnecessary detail, often abandoning the effort after a few pages in favor of more stimulating activities, such as watching paint dry or counting dust motes in the sunlight. Chapter 5. Meanwhile, in the coastal town of Greyport, the fishermen rose each morning to cast their nets into waters so calm and unchanging that they might as well have been sailing on a vast, shallow pond. The fish they caught were small and bony, suitable only for the most basic of soups, and the townsfolk had long since grown accustomed to the monotony of their meals. The local tavern, aptly named the Dull Tankard, served ale so weak that patrons could drink it all night without feeling the slightest hint of intoxication, leading to conversations that meandered aimlessly until everyone simply gave up and went home. The town's mayor, a man named Harold the Uninspired, had held his position for 20 years solely because no one else could be bothered to challenge him, his leadership consisting of little more than nodding along to whatever his advisers suggested before retreating to his chambers for an afternoon nap. Once, a traveling bard had passed through Greyport, hoping to entertain the villagers with songs of adventure and romance, but after a single performance to a half-empty room of disinterested listeners, he packed his loot and left before dawn, never to return. Chapter 6. The slow turning of the seasons in Eldermere brought with it no particular fanfare, as the spring rains were neither too heavy nor too light, the summer sun never scorching enough to inspire complaint, and the autumn leaves fading from green to brown with such lackluster enthusiasm that children didn't even bother to gather them for play. Winter was a grey, slushy affair, with just enough snow to be inconvenient but never enough for sleigh rides or snowball fights, leaving the villagers to huddle by their hearths and stare blankly into the flames as if waiting for some spark of excitement that never came. In the castle, the servants went about the duties with mechanical precision, scrubbing the same patches of stone floor until they shone dully, only for the thin layer of dust to settle back within hours, rendering their efforts meaningless. The royal gardener, a man named Oswin, tended to the same dozen shrubs year after year, pruning them into shapes that were neither artistic nor wild, but simply there, occupying space without drawing attention. Occasionally, a visiting dignitary from some equally forgettable neighboring fiefdom would arrive, and the court would go through the motions of hospitality, serving the same underwhelming meals and engaging in polite conversations so devoid of substance that even the most diplomatic guests struggled to feign interest before making their excuses to leave as soon as possible. Chapter 7. The library of Eldermere Castle housed thousands of volumes, each one more tedious than the last, filled with treatises on crop rotation methods, genealogies of long-dead nobles whose descendants couldn't be bothered to remember them, and ledgers documenting the kingdom's grain reserves in mind-numbing detail. The head librarian, a woman named Elspeth, had once been an eager scholar in her youth, but decades of cataloguing uninspiring texts had worn her down into a state of quiet resignation, her once sharp mind now content to lose itself in the repetitive task of organizing and reorganizing the same shelves. The most exciting discovery in the library's history had been a misplaced scroll from 2 centuries prior, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a recipe for a now obsolete type of porridge that no one had liked even at the time. Occasionally, a particularly restless noble would take it upon themselves to borrow a book, only to return it weeks later with the pages barely disturbed, admitting in a murmur that they hadn't been able to stay awake long enough to finish the first chapter. The dust in the library was thick and undisturbed, settling over the spines of the books like a soft, unbroken shroud, as if the knowledge within had long since given up any hope of being remembered. Chapter 8. In the eastern reaches of Duskhaven, there stood a small hamlet called Milford, named for the single, creaking watermill that turned with agonizing slowness, grinding grain into flour at a pace so leisurely that the villagers had learned to plan their baking schedules months in advance. The miller, a man named Godric, had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, and so on through generations of men who had all shared the same expression of weary acceptance. The mill's great wooden wheel groaned with every rotation, a sound so familiar to the villages that they no longer heard it, though visitors often found it maddening within minutes of arrival. The flour produced was adequate but unremarkable, much like everything else in Milford, and the villagers had long since resigned themselves to the fact that no one would ever sing praises of their bread or pastries. Once, a traveling merchant had attempted to sell them a bag of exotic spices, promising to revolutionize their cooking, but the villagers had simply stared at him in blank incomprehension before returning to the usual routine of plain, unseasoned meals. The spices were left forgotten in the back of a pantry until they lost all flavor, blending seamlessly into the general mediocrity of Milford's existence. Chapter 9. The annual meeting of the Eldermere and Duskhaven Border Commissioners was an event so devoid of drama that even the scribes assigned to record the proceedings often copied passages from previous year's documents rather than bother listening to the actual discussion. The two sides would gather in a dimly lit hall, seated at a long table that had once been polished to a shine but was now scarred with decades of unnoticed scratches and water rings. The commissioners would debate minor adjustments to the boundary markers, small stones placed at intervals so remote that no one could recall the last time they'd been inspected, and the discussions would drag on for hours without resolution, as neither kingdom cared enough to press for a decision. The most heated exchange in living memory had occurred when one commissioner dozed off mid-sentence, and his counterpart, mistaking his silence for a subtle insult, had huffed and adjusted his cloak in mild annoyance before the matter was dropped entirely. The meeting would conclude with a shared meal of cold meat pies and lukewarm cider, after which the commissioners would return to their respective kingdoms, their reports so dull that even the kings and queens who received them would set them aside unread, knowing that nothing of consequence had transpired. Chapter 10. In the distant marshlands of the southern border, a forgotten outpost stood crumbling under the weight of time, its purpose long since lost to memory. The few soldiers stationed there had not received new orders in years, and their uniforms had faded to a color that was neither green nor gray but something in between, much like the landscape around them. The days were spent mending the same patch of fence over and over, though no livestock or enemies ever approached to test its strength, and their nights were passed in silence, broken only by the occasional croak of a frog or the distant hoot of an owl. The captain of the outpost, a man named Leofric, had once been ambitious, but years of isolation had worn him down into a state of quiet apathy, and he now spent his afternoons whittling the same piece of wood into smaller and smaller shavings, never creating anything, simply passing the time until the next meal. Once every few months, a supply wagon would arrive with sacks of flour, salted meat, and a cask of ale so watered down that it barely qualified as such, and the soldiers would accept these provisions without comment, knowing better than to hope for anything more. The marsh stretched on in all directions, featureless and still, as if the world itself had forgotten this place existed. Chapter 11. The royal kitchens of Eldermere Castle operated with a monotonous efficiency that had long since extinguished any spark of culinary creativity among the staff. Each morning began with the same porridge, a lukewarm, lumpy concoction of oats and water that had been prepared in the exact same way for generations, seasoned with precisely 3 pinches of salt as decreed in some ancient, forgotten royal edict. The head cook, Mistress Agatha, moved through her daily routines with the weary determination of someone who had stopped questioning why things were done this way decades ago. The midday meal always consisted of boiled root vegetables, alternating between turnips and parsnips depending on the day of the week, and a tough cut of meat that had been simmered until all flavor and texture had surrendered completely. The castle's sole concession to variety came on Sundays, when the vegetables were mashed rather than boiled, though even this minor deviation was executed with such lack of enthusiasm that most diners couldn't tell the difference. The kitchen's single spice cabinet contained 3 jars, salt, a faded bundle of thyme that had turned to dust years ago, and an unlabeled container of something brown that no one dared to investigate too closely. Chapter 12. The royal treasury of Eldermere was a study in tedium, its vaults filled with coins so ordinary that even counterfeiters couldn't be bothered to replicate them. The kingdom's monetary system had remained unchanged for centuries, with copper pennies that were slightly too heavy to be practical, silver shillings that tarnished almost immediately after minting, and gold crowns that were so rarely used they might as well have been ceremonial. The treasurer, Lord Willoughby, spent his days counting and recounting the same stacks of coins, moving them from one ledger to another in a bureaucratic dance that served no discernible purpose. Each month, he would present his reports to the king in a ritual that had become so predictable that courtiers could mouth the words along with him: revenues remain steady, expenses unchanged, reserves adequate but unremarkable. The tax collectors, perhaps the least popular officials in the kingdom, performed the duties with a sort of apologetic diligence, knowing full well that the amounts they gathered were too small to make anyone truly wealthy but just large enough to be irritating. The most exciting financial event in recent memory had been the discovery of a misplaced decimal point in a sheep tax record from 20 years prior, an error that had gone unnoticed for so long that by the time it was found, everyone involved had either died or forgotten why it mattered. Chapter 13 The Royal Gardens of Duskhaven presented a spectacle of horticultural mediocrity that perfectly reflected the character of the kingdom itself. The head gardener, an elderly man named Bromley, had long since stopped trying to introduce new varieties of plants, content instead to maintain the same dozen species that had always grown there. The roses bloomed in a pale pink that was neither vibrant enough to be striking nor faded enough to be interesting, their petals dropping almost immediately after opening as if they couldn't be bothered to put on a proper display. The hedges were trimmed into shapes that were vaguely geometric but lacked any real precision, their edges softened by a perpetual layer of dust from the nearby road. The herb garden contained exactly 7 varieties of plants, all of which grew with such reluctance that the kitchen staff had taken to purchasing their seasonings from traveling merchants rather than wait for the garden's meager offerings. The most remarkable feature was a centuries-old oak tree that stood in the center of the garden, its growth so stunted by poor soil and indifferent care that it had barely increased in size since Queen Maribel's great-grandfather's time. Visitors often found themselves staring at it, trying to determine whether it was in fact growing very slowly or simply dying at an equally gradual pace. Chapter 14 The Eldermere Royal Guard presented perhaps the most perfect example of institutionalized tedium in the entire kingdom. The daily drills had not changed in living memory, consisting of the same 12 maneuvers performed in the same order with the same lack of enthusiasm. Their armor, polished to a dull sheen that reflected neither light nor pride, creaked with every movement, the sound becoming part of the background noise of the castle courtyard. The captain of the guard, Sir Edric, had won his position not through any particular display of skill or bravery, but simply by outlasting all other candidates through sheer persistence and an almost supernatural tolerance for boredom. The guard's primary duty consisted of standing at various doorways and archways around the castle, a task they performed with such perfect stillness that visitors often mistook them for statues until they blinked. Their weapons, standard-issue swords of adequate but unremarkable quality, had edges so dull they couldn't cut butter, though this was of little consequence as they had never been called upon to use them in anger. The most exciting moment in the guard's recent history had been when one of the younger recruits sneezed during the changing of the watch, an event so startling in its deviation from routine that it was still being discussed in hushed tones 3 months later. Chapter 15 The village of Willowbrick, situated midway between Eldermere and Duskhaven, served as the perfect embodiment of rural monotony. Its single street, lined with cottages that all looked nearly identical, ran straight from one end of the village to the other without a single curve or diversion to interrupt its perfect dullness. The villages, all related to each other in ways too complicated to unravel, went about their lives with the quiet resignation of people who had long since given up expecting anything interesting to happen. The local inn, the Sleeping Shepherd, served ale so weak and food so bland that travelers often chose to sleep in their carts rather than subject themselves to its dubious comforts. The village's sole claim to distinction was an annual festival celebrating the harvest of their namesake willow reeds, an event that consisted mainly of villagers standing around admiring the same baskets they wove every year before dispersing to their homes in disappointed silence. The oldest resident, a woman named Granny Hildy, had become something of a local celebrity by virtue of having once, 60 years ago, seen a traveling minstrel perform in the next village over, a story she told with such frequency and lack of variation that even the children could recite it word for word. The willow reeds themselves grew in the same sluggish bend of the river where they always had, their branches swaying in the breeze with a rhythm so predictable it could lull an insomniac to sleep within minutes. Would you like me to continue with another set of chapters? The narrative will maintain its deliberately soporific pace, with each new chapter blending seamlessly into the next in an unbroken stream of historical monotony. Let me know if you'd prefer any adjustments to the content or style. Chapter 16 The Royal Archives of Eldermere occupied a damp, windowless chamber beneath the castle's eastern wing where a solitary archivist named Brother Cuthbert spent his days cataloguing documents of such stunning irrelevance that even moths avoided the shelves. Each parchment was carefully inscribed with records of grain yields from harvests 3 centuries past, inventories of chamber pots purchased for royal guests who had died long ago, and minutes from council meetings where the most contentious debate had been whether to repair the castle's south guardrobe immediately or wait until spring. Brother Cuthbert's magnum opus, a 900-page concordance cross-referencing every mention of turnips in royal correspondence between the years 1247 and 1253 had taken him 14 years to complete and now gathered dust on a shelf labeled Miscellaneous Root Vegetables, Volume 23. The archive's most prized possession was King Aldric the Indecisive's personal diary from 1198, which contained 287 nearly identical entries reading, "Rose late. Ate porridge. Considered going hawking. Did not." Followed by increasingly elaborate doodles of what might have been badgers or possibly poorly rendered hedgehogs in the margins. Chapter 17 The Duskhaven Royal Orchestra, consisting of 7 marginally talented musicians and 1 profoundly tone-deaf harpist, performed the same 12 compositions in continuous rotation at every state function. Their rendition of The Ballad of the Dappled Mare, already a musical piece of remarkable blandness when first composed in 982, had through generations of lazy transcription and accumulated errors become something entirely unrecognizable, though no one had noticed the gradual transformation. The orchestra's conductor, Maestro Pembleton, waved his baton with the listless enthusiasm of a man conducting a dirge for his own career, his motions so subtle that the musicians often missed their cues entirely, resulting in performances where the flute might finish its solo several minutes after the violins had given up entirely. Their annual concert for Queen Maribel's birthday always concluded with a special arrangement of the national anthem played at such a lethargic tempo that attendees often mistook it for a new composition entitled Funeral March for a particularly uninteresting slug. The orchestra's sole innovation in decades had been the introduction of a triangle player in 1402, though this addition only served to punctuate the musical tedium with occasional, inexplicable metallic pings that startled elderly courtiers from their naps. Chapter 18 The Eldermere Royal Stables housed exactly 23 horses of such average conformation and temperament that visiting dignitaries often struggled to remember whether they'd ridden the chestnut or the slightly darker chestnut to the castle. The head groom, a man known only as Old Tom, had developed over 60 years of service a philosophical approach to horse care that emphasized doing as little as possible while maintaining the illusion of activity. The royal mounts were brushed just enough to remove visible dirt but not enough to actually shine, fed portions calculated to maintain their middling weight without encouraging either fat or muscle, and exercised along the same 3-mile loop of forest path so often that the horses could complete the route without guidance while half asleep. The stable's record book contained entries stretching back 2 centuries documenting each horse's name, alternating between Shadow, Dusty, and Bramble, with depressing regularity, purchase price always slightly over market value, and cause of death invariably old age or general decline. The most exciting event in stable history had occurred in 1387 when a marginally more spirited than usual mare kicked over a water bucket, an incident still referred to in hushed tones as the Great Flood by stable hands who had nothing better to discuss. Chapter 19. The Office of Royal Proclamations in Duskhaven employed 4 heralds whose sole duty was to announce decrees in the town square every third Thursday at precisely noon. Unfortunately, since Queen Maribel's reign had begun 32 years prior, there had been exactly 3 proclamations worth announcing, all minor adjustments to the fishing rights along the western riverbank, forcing the heralds to pad their performances with increasingly elaborate recitations of nothing at all. Herald Primus, the title denoting seniority rather than ability, would unfurl a scroll containing some variation of, "Be it known that Her Most Serene Majesty continues to reign with all customary dignity and grace," followed by 17 minutes of pompous throat-clearing and faux important pauses while pretending to read further instructions. The townsfolk had long since stopped attending these performances, though the baker's apprentice still came to mock the herald's pompous delivery, and old Widow Clemens used them as an alarm clock to remind her when to take her afternoon nap. The herald's tabards, once a vibrant purple, had faded to a murky grayish lavender from decades of sun exposure and infrequent washing, their embroidered crests now resembling amorphous blobs that might have been ducks or possibly wilted cabbages. Chapter 20. The village of Millcross, situated at the exact geographic center of the Whispering Plains, had achieved a perfect equilibrium of boredom so absolute that even the flies moved in slow motion. Its central feature was a crossroads where nothing ever crossed, the packed earth so undisturbed by traffic that a single set of wagon ruts from 1311, made by a lost merchant who promptly turned around, remained visible to this day. The villagers' dozen identical cottages surrounded a green where no games were ever played, the grass worn down not by activity but by centuries of listless foot dragging as residents moved between home and the villages. Only public building, a combined tavern, post office, chapel where nothing interesting ever happened in any of its functions. The tavern served ale brewed from the same recipe since 1124, a thin, sour concoction that made water seem flavorful by comparison. The post office handled an average of 3 letters per year, all from the same traveling wool merchant to his long-suffering wife, and the chapel's vicar delivered the same 7 sermons in rotation to a congregation that dozed through them with practiced ease. The village's sole moment of historical significance had occurred in 1276 when a cow wandered onto the crossroads and stood there for 3 days before anyone noticed it didn't belong to anyone, an event commemorated annually by the ceremonial placement of a different cow in the same spot, followed by an afternoon of mild staring and early bedtime. Chapter 21. The annual Eldermere Harvest Festival was an event so devoid of excitement that even the flies seemed to lose interest halfway through the proceedings, the entire affair consisting of the same 6 farmers presenting the same mediocre crops in the same order they had for generations, while the same half-interested nobles pretended to care before awarding the same blue ribbon to Farmer Hodges' turnips for the 37th consecutive year, not because they were particularly impressive turnips but because no one could remember a time when they hadn't given him the ribbon and it seemed too much effort to change tradition now. The festival grounds were decorated with the same faded bunting that had been reused since Queen Maribel's coronation, its colors so bleached by sun and rain that it now resembled old dishrags strung between poles, and the same wooden stalls that had been erected in the same configuration every year since anyone could remember creaked ominously in the wind but never quite collapsed, much like the spirits of those forced to attend. The highlight of the event was supposedly the pie-eating contest, but after the Great Lentil Pie incident of 1392, when 3 contestants fell asleep mid-bite, the rules had been amended to allow for naps between servings, rendering the competition more of a pie-napping marathon that often stretched into the following morning when the bakers would quietly remove the untouched pies and everyone would pretend someone had won. The festival always concluded with a ceremonial burning of the harvest effigy, a vaguely human-shaped bundle of straw so loosely constructed that it typically fell apart before the torch could be applied, after which the villagers would return to their homes, each secretly relieved that they wouldn't have to pretend to care about turnips for another year. Chapter 22. The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of maritime charts was a monument to bureaucratic pointlessness, containing 483 nearly identical maps of the same 2-mile stretch of coastline where nothing had ever happened and nothing ever would, each minutely detailed parchment painstakingly annotated with variations in tide patterns so insignificant that not even the most obsessive ship's captain could have found them useful. The ink faded to near invisibility after centuries of being ignored on the shelves. The library's lone maritime historian, a wisp of a man named Professor Thistlewick, had devoted his life to comparing these charts in search of some profound truth about the sea, but after 40 years of squinting at nearly identical drawings of the same nondescript bay, he had concluded only that the coastline had remained stubbornly unchanged since records began, a revelation so underwhelming that he had taken to napping in the archives rather than face the crushing disappointment of another day without discovery. The charts were kept in a special humidity-controlled chamber not because they were valuable, but because the librarian had once read that important documents should be stored thusly and no one had the heart to tell him these didn't qualify, the room's elaborate system of dehumidifiers and temperature gauges whirring away at great expense to preserve drawings of rocks that nobody had ever looked at twice while alive. The most exciting moment in the collection's history had occurred in 1427 when a particularly clumsy scribe had spilled tea on chart number 217, creating a stain that vaguely resembled a mermaid if one squinted, an discovery that had briefly excited the academic community until someone pointed out it was just a tea stain, after which interest had returned to its usual subterranean levels. Chapter 23 The Eldermere Royal Armoury was a cavernous hall filled with weapons so outdated and impractical that even the most desperate bandit would have turned them down, its racks holding row upon row of pikes with splintering shafts, swords with blades so corroded they resembled abstract art more than weapons, and crossbows whose strings had petrified into brittle threads that would snap at the slightest pressure, all meticulously catalogued by an armourer named Guntram who took perverse pride in maintaining equipment that hadn't been used in centuries. The armoury's prized possession was King Aldric the Hesitant's ceremonial battle armour, a suit so encrusted with decorative scrollwork and impractical embellishments that its wearer could barely lift his arms, let alone fight, last worn in 1123 during the Battle of Willow's Bend where the king had famously gotten stuck in a ditch and missed the entire conflict, an outcome everyone agreed had probably been for the best. Guntram spent his days polishing the same sets of chainmail over and over until the rings shone dully in the torchlight, then oiling them to prevent rust that never came because the humidity in the armory was too listless to support proper corrosion, his existence a perfect metaphor for the kingdom itself, preparing endlessly for battles that would never come, maintaining traditions long after their purpose had been forgotten, and taking quiet pride in work that mattered to no one. The armory's sole moment of excitement each year came during the annual inventory when Guntram would pretend to discover a missing dagger, always the same one, hidden in the same cupboard, prompting a day-long search that gave the aging armorer something to do before he found it right where he'd left it last year, a ritual that everyone humored because it was the closest thing to drama the armory ever produced. Chapter 24 The Duskhaven Royal Weather Observatory occupied a drafty tower where a single meteorologist named Brother Cloudberry recorded the same 7 weather patterns in endless rotation, his daily reports reading like a monk's meditation on monotony, overcast with a chance of lingering apathy, or light drizzle, spirits dampened accordingly, or his personal favorite, weather present. The observatory's prized instrument was a barometer so old it had last been calibrated during the reign of Queen Maribel's great-great-grandfather, its needle permanently stuck between fair and changeable, no matter the actual conditions outside, though this hardly mattered since Brother Cloudberry's predictions were always the same anyway, a 60% chance of more weather tomorrow, with a slight possibility of something slightly different the day after that, maybe. The observatory's logbooks stretched back 2 centuries, each page filled with nearly identical entries that collectively formed the most comprehensive record of climatic tedium ever assembled, a chronicle so devoid of extreme events that the single entry reading, "Hail," somewhat startling, from 1378 stood out like a shout in a cathedral. Brother Cloudberry's sole indulgence was an elaborate system of wind chimes he'd installed on the tower's parapet, though even these rarely made music since the winds over Duskhaven couldn't be bothered to blow with enough force to move them, their silent hanging a perfect representation of the observatory's raison d'etre. Chapter 25. The village of Pebbleton on the Wold was famous for absolutely nothing, a distinction its residents maintained with quiet determination, the daily routines as unchanging as the pebbles that gave the village its name, small, smooth stones that had lain in the same shallow ford for centuries without accomplishing anything worth noting. The village's central feature was a trough that had never held water properly due to a barely perceptible tilt in its construction, a flaw so minor that no one could be bothered to fix it but just significant enough to be mildly irritating, much like everything else in Pebbleton. The villagers gathered each evening at the same time to watch the same sunset over the same unremarkable hills, making the same comments about how the colors were quite nice tonight, in tones that suggested they said this every night regardless of actual conditions, which they did. The local tavern served a single beer brewed from a recipe so ancient and unvaried that modern yeast strains had apparently forgotten how to ferment it properly, resulting in a beverage that was somehow both flat and faintly fizzy, bitter yet bland, and entirely unforgettable in every conceivable way. The village's sole claim to fame was an ancient standing stone that might have been placed there by druids or might just be a particularly large rock that no one had bothered to move, its surface worn smooth by centuries of villagers touching it for luck before realizing nothing in Pebbleton ever changed enough to require luck, good or bad. Each year on the summer solstice, the villagers would hold a festival where they danced around the stone in a slow, shuffling circle until everyone got tired and went home, an event that perfectly encapsulated Pebbleton's approach to life, going through the motions without expectation, finding comfort in predictability, and never, ever rocking the boat, or in this case, the slightly tilted water trough. Chapter 26. The Eldermere Royal Tapestry Collection hung in the castle's east gallery where generations of moths had dined upon its threadbare scenes with the same lack of enthusiasm displayed by the occasional tour groups shuffling past, the woven narratives so faded and dull that even the most dedicated art scholars couldn't determine whether that brown smudge was meant to be King Aldric the Unmemorable's hunting dog or possibly a poorly rendered shrub, the entire collection having been commissioned during the reign of Queen Maribel, the uninspired's great-aunt, who had insisted on documenting every excruciatingly mundane moment of her 42-year reign, including the famous banquet of the slightly above-average turnips, which occupied 3 full panels depicting nearly identical scenes of nobles chewing with expressions of polite resignation. The tapestry curator, a desiccated old man named Master Wimblethorpe, gave the same half-hour lecture about textile preservation techniques to anyone foolish enough to make eye contact, his voice droning on about warp and weft with the cadence of a slow dripping faucet, the lecture unchanged since he first composed it in 1389 except for the occasional addition of yet another reason why the tapestries couldn't be cleaned or restored or even looked at too closely lest they disintegrate entirely, a fate many visitors secretly wished would befall the particularly tedious Procession of Tax Collectors series, which stretched for 18 panels depicting nearly identical men in brown robes holding scrolls at slightly varying angles. The collection's piece de resistance was a massive hanging purportedly showing the legendary Battle of Dull's Hollow, though the weaving was so worn and the colors so faded that it resembled nothing so much as a particularly aggressive laundry day, with vague shapes that might have been horses or possibly large hats engaged in conflict with blobs that could be swords or perhaps just unusually straight tree branches, the whole scene so devoid of drama that the explanatory placard had been updated at some point to read, "Allegorical representation of bureaucratic conflict," in a desperate attempt to make it seem intentionally boring rather than accidentally so. Chapter 27. The Duskhaven Office of Weights and Measures occupied a particularly airless chamber in the Royal Administrative Building where 3 clerks spent the days verifying that the kingdom's standards remained exactly as they had been for centuries, a task so devoid of variation that the senior clerk, a woman named Mistress Pendlebury, had developed the ability to fall into a light doze while still maintaining perfect penmanship in her daily logbook, which recorded, in excruciating detail, the exact same measurements day after day, year after year, the brass weights never gaining or losing so much as a grain of sand despite being constantly polished to prevent tarnishing that never came because the chamber was too dry and the clerks too diligent in their polishing. The office's primary function was to certify merchants' scales, though since all merchants in Duskhaven used the same 3 models of scales purchased from the same long-defunct scalemaker, this process consisted mainly of confirming that yes, once again, the 1 pound weight balanced the 1 pound weight exactly as it had the previous 1,743 times they'd checked, a revelation that never failed to produce the same polite nodding from all parties involved, followed by the application of the official wax seal in precisely the same spot on each scale's base where generations of identical seals had created a lump of colored wax the size and shape of a small mushroom. The officer's most exciting piece of equipment was the Royal Standard L, a length of oak rod carved with markings that had been the definitive measure of length since time immemorial, though after centuries of being measured against and polished by nervous merchants, it had worn down nearly a quarter-inch shorter than its original length, a fact everyone pretended not to notice because acknowledging it would require someone to do something about it, and that was simply too much effort for a discrepancy that small. Twice a year, the clerks would solemnly remove the kingdom's official set of liquid measures from their velvet-lined case to verify their volumes, a process that involved carefully pouring water from one vessel to another and confirming that yes, a pint was still a pint, a conclusion reached with the same quiet satisfaction one might feel when confirming that the sun had indeed risen again this morning. Chapter 28 The Eldermere Royal Herb Garden was a study in horticultural mediocrity where plants grew with the same lack of enthusiasm displayed by the undergardener whose sole responsibility was to watch them do so, the neatly arranged beds containing all the traditional medicinal herbs but none of the vigor or potency that might actually make them useful, the soil having long since been depleted of anything resembling nutrients but still dutifully turned each spring in the vague hope that this year might be different. The head herbalist, a woman named Mistress Chamomile, a coincidence of birth she regarded as both her greatest blessing and cruelest joke, spent her days preparing tinctures and salves of such mild effectiveness that patients often recovered despite them rather than because of them, her workshop filled with jars of dried plants that had lost whatever potency they might have once possessed through years of cautious over-drying, just to be safe. The garden's most famous feature was its heartsease patch, though the flowers had through generations of indifferent cultivation lost the distinctive heart-shaped markings and now resembled ordinary wild violets, only slightly less vibrant and more prone to wilting at the first sign of adversity. Each morning, Mistress Chamomile would make her rounds with a basket and shears, harvesting precisely the amount of each herb prescribed by the ancient gardening manual that had been her predecessor's Bible, never taking a sprig more or less than tradition dictated regardless of whether the plants could spare it or actually needed pruning, the ritual as unchanging as the sunrise and about as exciting. The garden's sole concession to modernity was a sundial installed during the reign of King Aldric the Punctual, though it had been placed in such deep shade by an overhanging yew tree that it was perpetually stuck at half-past indecipherable, a time that suited the garden's general atmosphere of sleepy inconsequence perfectly. Chapter 29 The Duskhaven Royal Menagerie housed a collection of animals so profoundly unexciting that visitors often mistook them for particularly lifelike statues until they blinked. The enclosures containing creatures selected specifically for their lack of threatening or interesting qualities, a family of hedgehogs that had forgotten how to curl into balls, a peacock that had lost most of its tail feathers and now resembled a disgruntled chicken, and an ancient tortoise that moved so infrequently the keepers had taken to dusting it weekly just to confirm it was still alive. The head keeper, a man named Wilsforth, went about his duties with the quiet desperation of someone who had once dreamed of working with majestic beasts but now spent his days coaxing a depressed lynx to eat its bland diet of boiled poultry and reminding visitors not to tap on the glass of the dormouse enclosure, not that the dormice would have noticed, being creatures of such profound torpor that they made sloths seem frenetic by comparison. The menagerie's star attraction was supposedly the royal white stag, a gift from Eldermere generations ago that had turned out to not be white at all but a very light brown that could maybe pass for off-white in certain lighting if you squinted, an animal so lacking in majesty that it spent most of its time leaning against its enclosure's back wall with an expression of profound existential fatigue. The feeding tours at noon and 4 o'clock drew modest crowds of the extremely easily amused, who would watch in respectful silence as keepers placed identical bowls of bland mash before each animal, the creatures approaching their meals with the same lack of enthusiasm displayed by Eldermere's peasants facing yet another bowl of turnip stew, the entire spectacle about as thrilling as watching paint dry but significantly less colorful. Chapter 30. The village of Bottomley in the mire clung to the edge of the great fens like a particularly stubborn piece of grime on a washboard, its 24 cottages arranged in a circle so perfect it suggested either ancient mystical significance or more likely a complete lack of imagination among its founders, the entire settlement sinking slowly but inexorably into the peat at a rate too gradual to notice but too consistent to ignore. The villages, a breed apart even by the standards of the region's famously dull inhabitants, specialized in crafting willow baskets of such perfectly average quality that even the most desperate peddlers struggled to find anything complimentary to say about them, their famed double weave technique producing containers that were neither noticeably stronger nor more attractive than single weave but took twice as long to make, a fact the villagers cited with inexplicable pride. The village elder, a man named Thistlethwaite who had achieved his position simply by outliving everyone else, presided over monthly meetings where the same 3 topics were discussed in the same order every time. 1. The need to repair the duck pond's fence, though no one could remember there ever being ducks. 2. Whether this might finally be the year they repainted the signpost, it never was. And 3. A moment of silence for old Nan's legendary blackberry jam, which no one alive had actually tasted but which everyone agreed had probably been very good based on the jar that had sat unopened on the meeting hall shelf since time immemorial. The village's single claim to distinction was the Bottomley frog, a supposedly ancient amphibian that lived in the Dullest pond and was either a miraculous survivor or more likely a series of identical frogs replaced periodically, though no one had ever seen more than one at a time and the current specimen looked suspiciously fresh for something allegedly pushing 200 years old. Each summer solstice, the villagers would gather to crown the frog with a tiny wreath of watercress while singing a traditional song that consisted mainly of humming, the ceremony ending exactly as it always did, with the frog hopping away mid-chorus and everyone agreeing that yes, that had been lovely, same as last year, and probably the same as next year too. Chapter 31. The Eldermere Royal Orchestra's practice sessions were exercises in auditory tedium that stretched for hours without ever quite achieving anything resembling musicality, the musicians having long since given up on such frivolities as tuning their instruments or playing at the same tempo, resulting in a sound best described as several cats walking across different broken instruments at slightly varying speeds. The conductor, Maestro Pembleforth, waved his baton with all the enthusiasm of a man swatting at gnats, his gestures so subtle and infrequent that the violinists had taken to playing cards during rehearsals while the woodwind section perfected the art of circular breathing specifically so they could take naps without pausing their playing. The orchestra's repertoire consisted of 7 compositions all written during the reign of King Aldric the Tone-Deaf, each more forgettable than the last, their sheet music yellowed with age and blurred by generations of musicians' tears falling onto the pages as they contemplated spending another evening performing the monarch's minuet for the 912th time. The brass section's trumpets were permanently muted not for artistic effect but because the original mutes had become stuck sometime during the previous century and no one had mustered the energy to remove them, giving every fanfare the distant, muffled quality of a battle being fought several towns over. The orchestra's sole moment of variety came during the annual winter festival when they were required to play slightly faster to represent jollity, a tempo change that invariably caused the cellist to lose his place and the flautist to hyperventilate, resulting in performances where the intended cheerful melody emerged as something more akin to a musical description of a mild panic attack in slow motion. Chapter 32. The Duskhaven Office of Heraldry and Sigils occupied a cramped tower room where 4 aging clerks spent the days debating the precise shade of puce that should be used to represent the Queen's third cousin's wife's family crest, arguments that could stretch for weeks without resolution and often ended with everyone forgetting what they'd been discussing in the first place. The walls were lined with heraldry books so dense and poorly indexed that looking up any particular coat of arms became an exercise in futility, The tomes filled with elaborate descriptions of insignia so similar to one another that even the clerks couldn't tell them apart without consulting the master index, which had itself been misfiled sometime in the 1370s and never recovered. The office's most heated controversy in living memory had erupted over whether a certain noble family's crest depicted a duck or a goose, a debate that had raged for 3 years before someone pointed out the bird in question was clearly meant to be a swan, a revelation that disappointed everyone so profoundly they immediately dropped the subject and pretended it had never come up. The official seal press, used to emboss wax with the kingdom's various heraldic symbols, had accumulated so many layers of dried wax over the centuries that the impressions now emerged as vague blobs that could represent anything from a lion rampant to a slightly aggressive muffin depending on how the light hit them, though this was considered an improvement over the original crisp designs which had required actual effort to produce. Twice a year, the head herald would solemnly remove the royal banner from its storage chest to inspect for moth damage, an event treated with all the ceremony of a religious rite despite the fact the banner hadn't been unfurled in living memory and probably wouldn't survive the attempt, its threads hanging together more out of habit than any real structural integrity. Chapter 33 The Eldermere Royal Library's collection of royal decrees filled an entire wing with shelves upon shelves of identically bound volumes containing laws so specific and situational that they had never been applied even once, each page painstakingly calligraphed by generations of scribes who had clearly been trying to justify their existence through sheer volume of output rather than any actual usefulness. The most frequently referenced decree, concerning the proper method for transporting turnips across municipal boundaries during leap years, ran to 73 pages of excruciating detail before concluding that actually, it was probably better not to transport turnips at all under those circumstances, a masterwork of bureaucratic circumlocution that had taken a team of 5 lawyers 14 months to compose. The library's lone legal scholar, a desiccated old man named Jurisprudence, a name his parents had bestowed either as a cruel joke or a startling lack of imagination, could often be found napping atop a particularly thick volume titled, Regulations Governing the Measurement and Taxation of Hedge Widths in the Southern Provinces, his wheezing snores blending seamlessly with the general atmosphere of scholarly torpor that permeated the place. The decrees were organized according to a cataloging system so convoluted that even its creator had forgotten how it worked within weeks of implementing it, resulting in the curious phenomenon of certain volumes being impossible to find when needed but constantly turning up when searching for something completely unrelated, like a particularly persistent ghost with nothing better to haunt than legal minutiae. The collection's piece de resistance was King Aldric the Verbose's 1,200-page decree concerning decree composition standards, which had itself required 17 supplemental decrees to clarify and which no one had ever read in its entirety, though 3 scribes had died trying. Chapter 34 The Duskhaven Royal Stables housed exactly 14 horses of such uniformly average conformation that even the stablemaster couldn't tell them apart without consulting the registry, a massive ledger that itself contained so many errors and contradictions that it was essentially useless, not that it mattered since all the horses performed the duties with identical mediocrity anyway. The head groom, a man named Stebbins who smelled permanently of hay and resignation, went about his work with the quiet desperation of someone who had once dreamed of tending to mighty war horses but now spent his days brushing coats that never quite shone and picking hooves that never stayed clean for more than 5 minutes, the very definition of Sisyphean labor with significantly more horse manure involved. The royal carriage horses were trained to walk at a pace so precisely calibrated to be unremarkable that the Queen's procession through town took exactly 47 minutes every time regardless of distance or weather conditions, the animals having perfected a sort of ambling gait that gave spectators ample time to realize they had better things to do before the carriage had moved 20 yards. The stable's most exciting feature was the hayloft, which generations of stable boys had claimed was haunted, though the ghost, if it existed, had apparently decided that rattling chains or moaning ominously was too much effort and instead contented itself with occasionally making the hay bales settle in a slightly more unsettling manner than usual, a paranormal manifestation so subtle it was often mistaken for a mild breeze. Each morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Stebbins would make his rounds with a measuring stick to confirm all the horses were still the same height they'd been the day before, a ritual that had never once produced an interesting result but which he continued out of some vague sense that stopping might invite chaos into their carefully maintained world of equine monotony. Chapter 35 The village of Upper Thimblewick, so named to distinguish it from Lower Thimblewick, though no one could remember why, as they were identical in every measurable way, specialized in the production of woolen undergarments of such legendary itchiness that they were said to have played a key role in several historical military defeats when soldiers wearing them had been too distracted by discomfort to fight properly. The village's entire economy revolved around a single watermill that ground wool with all the enthusiasm of a particularly lazy glacier. The resulting fabric then dyed in one of three approved shades: murky brown, sludge green, or a color the villagers insisted was red but which most outsiders would describe as dried blood in poor lighting, before being fashioned into garments that combined the warmth of a light spring breeze with the comfort of a hair shirt. The village elder, a woman named Agatha Threadgood, a surname that constituted false advertising of the highest order, presided over weekly meetings where the same 5 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The mill wheel needed oiling, it always did. 2. Someone's sheep had wandered into someone else's vegetable patch again, it was usually old Tom's sheep. 3. The dye vats needed replenishing, they were down to their last decade's supply of murky brown. 4. Complaints about this season's wool quality, always either too scratchy or not scratchy enough depending on who you asked. And 5. A moment of silence for Great Aunt Mildred's legendary darning needle, which had been lost in 1274 but which everyone agreed had probably been very sharp. The village's annual wool festival was an event so profoundly dull that even the sheep seemed bored by it, featuring such thrilling attractions as a yarn-tossing contest, distance, not accuracy, a sheep shearing demonstration that took approximately 3 times longer than necessary due to the shearer's arthritic hands, and the ceremonial weighing of the season's wool clip-on scales that everyone knew hadn't been calibrated since before the Great Sheep Bloat of 1321. Visitors to Upper Thimblewick often remarked that time seemed to move slower there, a phenomenon the villagers attributed to their traditional ways, but which physicists would likely blame on the sheer gravitational pull of collective boredom warping the space-time continuum. Chapter 36 The Eldermere Royal Observatory was a domed structure where the kingdom's lone astronomer, a myopic old man named Professor Ponderby, tracked the movements of celestial bodies with all the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry, his nightly vigils spent peering through a telescope so antiquated that its lens had developed a permanent fog that no amount of polishing could remove, rendering every star as a faint blur that might just as easily have been a smudge on the glass for all the difference it made. The observatory's logbooks stretched back generations, each page filled with nearly identical observations about the usual constellations being in the usual positions, and the occasional note about a cloud passing overhead that had briefly obscured the view of nothing in particular, the cumulative effect being the most comprehensive record of astronomical non-events ever compiled. Professor Ponderby's greatest contribution to the field had been his discovery of what he called the Comet of Mild Interest, in 1398, a celestial object so dim and slow-moving that by the time anyone else had verified its existence it had already left the solar system, never to return and barely remembered even by those who had seen it. The observatory's clock, a massive brass mechanism that had once kept perfect time, now lost approximately 3 minutes per day due to a worn gear that no one could be bothered to replace, meaning that every astronomical event occurred either slightly earlier or later than predicted depending on how recently someone had remembered to adjust it, a margin of error that suited Eldermere's general approach to precision perfectly. Each evening at sunset, Professor Ponderby would perform the ritual winding of the clock while humming the same off-key tune his predecessor had hummed before him, the sound mingling with the creaking of the dome's rusted rotation mechanism to create a sort of mechanical lullaby that often put the old astronomer to sleep before he'd finished his first round of observations, leaving the stars to wheel unnoticed over Eldermere as they had for centuries and would no doubt continue to do for centuries more. Chapter 37 The Duskhaven Office of Trade and Commerce was a stuffy chamber where bureaucrats moved papers from one pile to another with the grim determination of men who knew their work was meaningless but lacked the imagination to do anything else. The walls lined with ledgers documenting trade agreements so inconsequential that even the merchants involved had forgotten they existed. The office's chief function was to issue permits for the transport of goods between villages, a process so Byzantine in its requirements that most merchants simply bypassed it altogether, leaving the clerks to process the same 3 applications over and over from the handful of rule followers too timid to risk smuggling their turnips across county lines without proper documentation. Head clerk Witherspoon presided over this exercise in futility with all the gravitas of a king holding court, his quill scratching out approvals and denials with equal indifference, the decisions based not on any coherent policy but rather on which pile happened to need balancing at that particular moment. The office's most prized possession was the official seal of commerce, a massive brass stamp that weighed nearly 15 pounds and required both hands to operate, its impressions so deep they could be felt through 3 sheets of parchment yet so ornate as to be completely illegible, a perfect metaphor for the bureaucracy it represented. Twice a year, the clerks would perform an inventory of their ink supplies, counting each vial with ceremonial precision before recording the totals in a ledger that itself consumed more ink than the entire office used in a month, the ritual culminating in the ceremonial sharpening of every quill in the building, an event that took most of the afternoon and left everyone involved covered in feather dust and existential despair. Chapter 38 The Eldermere Royal Armoury's collection of ceremonial weapons was a study in ostentatious impracticality, each piece so encrusted with decorative elements as to be nearly useless for actual combat, the racks filled with swords whose blades were etched with so many floral patterns they resembled fancy letter openers more than weapons, and maces whose heads were so ornately sculpted they would likely shatter upon first impact. The armourer, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Brickenthorpe who had never actually seen battle but could polish a breastplate to a mirror finish in under 10 minutes, spent his days maintaining equipment that hadn't been used in generations, his workshop filled with the smell of oil and the sound of his own increasingly labored breathing as he struggled to reach the more tarnish-prone areas of particularly elaborate helms. The collection's centerpiece was King Aldric the Ornate's personal battle armor, a suit so heavily embellished with scrollwork and filigree that its wearer could barely bend at the waist, let alone fight, last worn during the Battle of Willow's End where the king had famously gotten stuck in his own saddle and had to be carried from the field by 6 squires, an incident the royal historians had diplomatically recorded as a strategic withdrawal to better assess the battlefield. Each spring, Sergeant Brickenthorpe would conduct a full inventory of the armory's contents, a process that mainly involved confirming that yes, all 743 items were still exactly where they'd been last year except for the ceremonial dagger that kept mysteriously appearing in different locations, a phenomenon the old armorer attributed to gremlins but which was more likely due to his own failing memory and the fact that the dagger closely resembled several others in the collection. The armory's sole concession to modernity was a single crossbow that had been new when Sergeant Brickenthorpe's grandfather had been in charge, its string now so brittle with age that drawing it would likely cause the weapon to disintegrate in the user's hands, a fact that didn't stop the armorer from oiling its mechanism every 3rd Tuesday with the same care he might give to a functioning weapon. Chapter 39 The village of Nether Bottom, so named because it occupied the least desirable stretch of land in the valley, was famous for exactly 3 things: its exceptionally hard cheese, its unusually soft mud, and the fact that absolutely nothing of note had ever happened there since its founding in 1123. The cheese, known locally as Old Stubborn, was aged in caves until it reached a consistency somewhere between rock and leather, its flavor profile best described as present, and its primary culinary use being as a doorstop or possibly a building material in a pinch. The mud, by contrast, had a reputation for being so soft and clingy that travelers claimed it could suck the boots right off your feet, though this was likely an exaggeration since no one ever stayed in Nether Bottom long enough to verify the claim. The village's central gathering point was a crooked old oak tree that had stopped growing centuries ago but refused to fall over out of sheer spite, its gnarled branches providing meager shade for the monthly town meetings where the same 5 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The cheese caves needed cleaning again. 2. The mud on the western path was particularly bad this season, as it was every season. 3. Someone's goat had gotten into Widow Thimble's garden, usually Old Tom's goat. 4. The annual cheese festival planning, always the same as last year's. And 5. A moment of silence for Great Uncle Thaddeus's legendary cheese press, which had broken in 1287 but which everyone agreed had probably been very sturdy. The Cheese Festival was the highlight of Netherbottom's social calendar, featuring such thrilling attractions as a cheese rolling contest won every year by the same boulder because no human could outroll it, a cheese tasting competition where participants tried to identify subtle flavors that didn't actually exist, and the ceremonial blessing of that year's cheese wheels by the village elder, a ritual that mainly involved waving some dried herbs over them and hoping for the best. Visitors to Netherbottom often remarked that time seemed to stand still there, a phenomenon the villagers took as a compliment but which physicists would likely attribute to the sheer gravitational pull of existential inertia. Chapter 40 The Duskhaven Royal Archives collection of marriage records filled an entire wing of the castle's lowest level, the shelves groaning under the weight of volumes documenting unions so unremarkable that even the couples involved had often forgotten their own anniversary dates, each entry painstakingly calligraphed by clerks who seemed to be competing to see who could make the word matrimony look the most depressing. The head archivist, a woman named Mistress Quilworthy who had not smiled since 1382, presided over this temple to bureaucratic excess with all the joy of a prison warden, her ink-stained fingers flipping through pages with mechanical precision as she located records for visitors who were usually disappointed to discover how mundane their ancestors' lives had been. The archive's most frequently requested document was the marriage contract between King Aldric the Uninspired and Queen Maribel the Taciturn, a document so devoid of romance that it read more like a business agreement for the joint ownership of a particularly unprofitable mill, the only hint of passion being a single clause about duty to produce an heir that had been crossed out and rewritten 3 times before both parties had apparently given up and settled for the current arrangement of polite indifference. The collection's organizational system was so convoluted that finding any particular record required consulting at least 3 different indexes, each contradicting the others in subtle ways that added hours to every search, a feature Mistress Quilworthy defended as preserving the integrity of the archival process, but which most visitors suspected was just a way to justify her position. Each winter, the archivists would perform the ritual of the dusting, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, wiped with a special cloth that seemed to redistribute dust rather than remove it, and then returned to a slightly different location, for better airflow, a practice that had over the centuries resulted in such complete chaos that even Mistress Quilworthy couldn't say for certain where anything was anymore, though she would never admit this to outsiders. The archive's sole concession to modernity was a single hourglass used to time lunch breaks, though the sand had become so clogged with years of accumulated dust that it now took approximately 2.5 hours for the top bulb to empty, a fact the archivists had learned to work around by simply declaring lunch over whenever they felt like getting back to work. Chapter 41 The Eldermere Royal Baths were a sprawling complex of tepid pools and lukewarm springs where the nobility took their leisure in waters so devoid of therapeutic qualities that visitors often emerged feeling slightly worse than when they'd entered, the entire establishment maintained by a staff of attendants who moved with the lethargy of people who had absorbed the torpor of their surroundings through prolonged exposure. The master of baths, a perpetually damp man named Soakworthy, presided over this temple of tepidness with all the enthusiasm of a man watching moss grow, his daily routine consisting of testing each pool's temperature with his elbow, a method he swore by despite its complete lack of accuracy, before declaring them perfectly adequate, regardless of actual conditions. The bath's signature treatment was the Royal Mineral Soak, which promised revitalization through a proprietary blend of salts that were in fact just ordinary table salt that had been left near some vaguely interesting rocks for a few days to absorb the essence, a process so ineffective that even the most credulous nobles had stopped requesting it years ago, though the staff still went through the motions of preparing it each morning out of some vague sense of tradition. The changing rooms were furnished with benches that had been polished to a dangerous slickness by generations of bare bottoms sliding across them, and the towels, though plentiful, were of such coarse weave that they seemed better suited to sanding furniture than drying skin, a fact the attendants brushed off with the explanation that a bit of exfoliation never hurt anyone. The bath's most celebrated feature was the steam chamber, though the mechanism for producing steam had broken during the reign of King Aldric the Moist and now produced nothing more than a faint damp smell and the occasional suspicious dripping sound from the ceiling, an atmosphere that somehow still commanded an extra fee for premium relaxation. Each evening at closing time, Soakworthy would make his rounds with a long-handled net to skim non-existent debris from the water's surface, a ritual that mainly served to remind everyone that yes, the baths were technically still open, though why anyone would visit after seeing this half-hearted maintenance routine was a mystery lost to time. Chapter 42 The Duskhaven Office of Royal Correspondence occupied a draughty tower where a dozen scribes labored over letters so devoid of meaningful content that they often spent more time deciding which shade of sealing wax to use than actually composing the messages themselves, the walls lined with pigeonholes containing correspondence that had been pending response for decades. Chief Scribe Pendlebury, a man whose handwriting had become progressively smaller over the years until it now resembled the frantic scratching of a spider dipped in ink, spent his days drafting replies to inquiries no one could remember making, his quill moving across the parchment with the joyless precision of a prisoner tallying days on a cell wall. The office's most voluminous correspondence was with the Eldermere Ministry of Agriculture, an exchange that had been ongoing since 1273 and consisted mainly of polite inquiries about turnip yields and equally polite non-answers that somehow managed to say even less than the original questions, the entire collection filling 17 volumes that no one had ever opened except to add the latest installment. The scribes took turns operating the office's sole functioning wax seal, a privilege that rotated weekly and was treated with all the ceremony of a royal coronation, though the seal itself had become so worn over the centuries that its impression now resembled a blob with delusions of heraldry. Each afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, the scribes would pause their work to perform the ritual of the inkwells, a solemn ceremony in which all the office's ink was poured from one container to another for reasons no one could remember but which was believed to maintain proper liquidity, a superstition that had somehow hardened into policy despite the fact it mainly resulted in stained fingers and ruined sleeves. The office's sole concession to efficiency was a system of message tubes that connected various departments, though these were so frequently clogged with decades of unsent drafts and forgotten memos that most scribes simply carried messages by hand, a practice that ensured nothing urgent ever arrived quickly enough to actually matter. Chapter 43 The Eldermere Royal Kennels housed exactly 14 hunting dogs of such impeccable breeding and complete disinterest in actual hunting that they had become more like mobile floor decorations than working animals, their days spent lounging on embroidered cushions and occasionally mustering enough energy to wag a tail when the kennel master walked by with treats. Head kennelman Goutworth, a man who smelled permanently of wet dog and resignation, went about his duties with the quiet desperation of someone who had once dreamed of training mighty hounds but now spent his days brushing coats that shed faster than he could remove the hair and trying to convince the king's favourite spaniel, Sir Fluffington III, that yes, he did in fact need to go outside to relieve himself occasionally. The kennel's training yard was a masterpiece of unused potential, its obstacle course worn smooth by years of neglect and its scent trails long since faded into the earth, though Goutworth still set up the jumps every morning out of some vague sense of professional pride before watching the dogs ignore them completely in favor of napping in the sun. The Royal Pack's sole concession to their supposed purpose was an annual hunt breakfast where they were paraded before the nobility and allowed to sniff at some strategically placed fox urine before being led back to their cushions, an event that had somehow become the social highlight of the season despite its complete lack of actual hunting. Each evening at sunset, Goutworth would make his rounds with a lantern to count noses, a ritual that mainly served to confirm that yes, all 14 dogs were still present and still profoundly uninterested in doing anything more strenuous than sighing dramatically when the dinner was 5 minutes late. The kennel's most exciting moment in recent memory had been when Sir Fluffington Ivy had briefly chased his own tail in 1398, a display of energy so out of character that it had been recorded in the kennel logs as the Great Exertion, and never repeated. Chapter 44. The village of Mudbottom, so named because the founders had apparently run out of creativity after naming Netherbottom and Bottomley in the mire, was famous for its annual mud festival, an event so profoundly unexciting that even the mud seemed bored by it, the entire celebration consisting of villagers standing around watching a particularly viscous patch of earth to see if anything interesting would happen. It never did. The villagers' main industry was mud collection, a profession that involved scooping the local specialty, a particularly fine-grained grey sludge that was neither good for pottery nor agriculture but which the villagers insisted had certain indefinable qualities, into barrels that were then shipped to places that had presumably ordered them by mistake. Village elder Sludgeworth, a man who had somehow managed to coat even his eyebrows in a permanent layer of dust, presided over monthly meetings where the same three topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The mud was particularly muddy this season, it always was. 2. Someone's pig had gotten stuck in the main street again, usually Old Tom's pig. And 3. Preparations for the mud festival needed to begin soon, meaning someone should probably look at last year's plans eventually. The mud festival's main attraction was the ceremonial stirring of the great mud pot, a centuries-old cauldron filled with what was theoretically a secret blend of local clays but which in reality was just whatever muck happened to be nearby, stirred with a paddle so old it had become part of the village's founding myths. Visitors to the festival could enjoy such thrilling activities as mud painting, using mud as both medium and canvas, mud sculpting, where all entries inevitably looked like blobs because they were blobs, and the highly anticipated mud tasting, which no one had actually participated in since the Great Indigestion incident of 1321 but which remained on the schedule out of tradition. The festival always concluded with the crowning of the Mud King or Queen, an honor that mainly involved getting to wear a cloak that was slightly less muddy than everyone else's and pretending to enjoy it. Chapter 45. The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of poetry filled an entire wing with volumes of verse so stunningly mediocre that even the librarians reshelved them with noticeable reluctance, the shelves groaning under the weight of countless odes to turnips, sonnets about slightly different turnips, and epic ballads about the time a moderately interesting turnip had been grown in 1247, a literary event that had somehow spawned 17 competing versions, each more forgettable than the last. The head librarian, a woman named Mistress Bookworthy who had not voluntarily read a poem since childhood, presided over this temple to literary ennui with all the joy of someone watching paint dry, her daily routine consisting of gently discouraging visitors from actually opening any of the volumes while pretending to dust covers that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The collection's most celebrated work was The Lay of the Slightly Above Average Harvest, a 1,200-line epic that managed to make even famine sound boring, its rhyming couplets plodding along with the relentless monotony of a plough horse that had given up on life. The poetry wing's sole patron was an elderly nobleman who came every Tuesday to read the same three pastoral poems about sheep grazing, or possibly about clouds, the metaphors were unclear, before falling asleep in the same overstuffed chair, a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for 23 years and showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Each spring, the librarians performed the ritual of the airing, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, fanned briefly to circulate the words, and then returned to a slightly different location based on a cataloguing system that made sense only to a librarian who had died in 1274, a practice that ensured no one could ever find anything without asking for help, thus guaranteeing at least some human interaction in an otherwise profoundly lonely corner of the library. The poetry wing's sole concession to modernity was a small sign reading, "Silence please," that had hung crookedly since before living memory and which no one had ever thought to straighten, possibly because it was the most interesting thing in the entire department. Chapter 46. The Eldermere Royal Clock Tower stood as a monument to temporal mediocrity, its massive timekeeping mechanism clicking forward with all the enthusiasm of a snail attending its own funeral, the great gears turning with such lethargy that the clock routinely lost between 7 and 23 minutes per day depending on humidity levels and how recently the clockmaster had remembered to wind it. Clockmaster Pendulum, a man who had aged into near-perfect synchronization with his charges, moved through his daily routines with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same actions so many times he no longer needed to think about them, his arthritic fingers adjusting weights and polishing brass with motions so practiced they had become a sort of horological ballet in slow motion. The tower's 4 faces each told slightly different times owing to a complex series of alignment issues that had accumulated over centuries of half-hearted maintenance, a phenomenon the locals had come to accept as part of the kingdom's charm, reasoning that if one needed to know the exact time that badly, they were probably in too much of a hurry to appreciate Eldermere's relaxed pace anyway. The clock's chime, theoretically designed to ring on the hour, had developed such an irregular cadence over the years that it now functioned more as a vague temporal suggestion than an actual marker of time, its dull bongs often trailing off into silence after 3 or 4 notes as if the mechanism itself had grown bored with the exercise. Each noon, Clockmaster Pendulum would perform the ceremonial winding ritual, turning the massive key exactly 17.5 times before pausing to cough, always at the same spot in the ritual, as if even his bronchial spasms followed a schedule, then finishing with 3 more turns and a pat to the mainspring housing that accomplished nothing practical but which he believed kept the old girl happy. The tower's most exciting feature was its theoretical ability to display phases of the moon, though the mechanism had frozen on, waxing gibbous, sometime during the reign of King Aldric the Unobservant, and no one had mustered the energy to fix it, leaving Eldermere's nights to unfold in perpetual lunar limbo as far as the clock was concerned. Chapter 47 The Duskhaven Office of Ceremonial Garments was a musty chamber where tailors moved with the enthusiasm of condemned men, their needles flashing in the dim light as they repaired the same dozen outfits that had been used in royal processions for generations, each stitch placed with the grim determination of people who knew their work would never be appreciated but lacked the imagination to do anything else. Head seamstress Threadworthy, a woman whose fingers were permanently pricked from decades of working with fabrics that seemed to resist improvement, presided over this temple to sartorial monotony with all the joy of someone dressing a corpse, her measuring tape perpetually draped around her neck like a noose waiting for its moment. The office's prized possession was Queen Maribel the Taciturn's coronation robe, a garment so encrusted with pearls and gold thread that it weighed nearly 30 pounds and had to be supported by a special frame when not in use, its design so impractical that it had only been worn once before being retired to permanent display status, where it slowly gathered dust under a protective sheet that did little to protect but much to gather dust. The tailors spent most of their time repairing the standard issue court uniforms, woolen tunics in a shade officially described as royal puce, but which most observers would call dried blood left in the sun too long, their needles darting in and out of fabric that seemed to dissolve at the touch of sunlight, each repair lasting just long enough to get through the next state function before unraveling again. Twice a year, the staff would perform the Great Air Out, dragging all the ceremonial garments into the courtyard where they would flap limply in the breeze for exactly 1 hour before being returned to storage, a ritual that theoretically prevented moth damage but mainly served to remind everyone how faded and outdated the kingdom's wardrobe had become. The office's sole concession to modernity was a single pair of scissors that had been imported from Eldermere in 1392 and were kept under lock and key, not because they were particularly valuable but because no one wanted to be responsible for losing the only sharp cutting instrument in the entire department. Chapter 48 The Eldermere Royal Gardens were a study in controlled disappointment, the geometrically perfect hedges enclosing flower beds that bloomed with all the enthusiasm of conscripted soldiers, each petal unfolding reluctantly as if aware that no one would truly appreciate its efforts. Head gardener Greenthumb, a man whose name was the only optimistic thing about him, moved through the rows with the weary air of someone fighting a losing battle against nature's indifference, his pruning shears snapping at wayward branches with the joyless precision of an executioner who had grown bored with his work. The garden's signature feature was the maze of mild perplexity, A hedge arrangement so simple in its design that even the kingdom's dullest children could navigate it blindfolded, its towering green walls trimmed to razor straightness every fortnight to maintain an appearance of challenge where none actually existed. The rose arbor, theoretically the garden's crowning glory, produced blooms of such perfect mediocrity that florists often struggled to find anything complimentary to say about them, their petals falling almost immediately after opening as if embarrassed by their own lackluster performance. Each morning at dawn, Green Thumb would make his rounds with a wheelbarrow full of mulch that he distributed with the same measured indifference one might show when feeding prisoners gruel, his movements so practiced that he could complete the entire circuit without once looking up from the ground he so resented tending. The garden's sole water feature was a fountain depicting some long-forgotten aquatic deity whose face had eroded into a featureless blob over the centuries, its basin filled with water so stagnant that mosquitoes avoided it on principle, the whole structure producing a trickle that sounded less like babbling brook and more like a very old man trying to clear his throat. Visitors to the royal gardens often remarked on how very green everything was, a compliment that sounded nice until one realized it was the only adjective that could honestly be applied to the entire landscape. Chapter 49 The village of Lower Sludgewick, so named to distinguish it from Upper Sludgewick, though no one could remember why, as they were equally unremarkable, specialized in the production of candles so foul-smelling that they were rumored to have been used as a defensive weapon during the brief and thoroughly inconclusive War of the Mildly Irritated Neighbors in 1347. The village's entire economy revolved around a single tallow vat that bubbled day and night with a substance that was technically edible but which most creatures, including the village dogs, would only approach under duress, its acrid smoke hanging over the settlement like a permanent fog of existential despair. Village elder Tallowby, a man who smelled like a side of beef left in the sun too long, presided over monthly meetings where the same four topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The tallow vat needed stirring, it always did. 2. Someone's cow had wandered into the rendering yard again, usually old Tom's cow. 3. Complaints about this season's candle quality, always either too smelly or not smelly enough depending on who you asked. And 4. A moment of silence for Great Aunt Mabel's legendary wick-twisting technique, which had been lost to time but which everyone agreed had probably been very effective. The village's annual candle festival was an event so dimly lit that half the attendees routinely walked into each other, featuring such thrilling attractions as a candle carving competition where all entries inevitably resembled the same vaguely phallic blob, a tallow tasting contest which no one had actually won since 1289 when the sole participant had to have his stomach pumped, and the ceremonial lighting of the Great Candle, a 6-foot monstrosity that burned with all the enthusiasm of a damp match and usually went out before the singing finished. Visitors to Lower Sludgewick often left with headaches and a vague sense of having wasted their time, though the villagers took this as proof of their candle's distinctive character rather than what it actually was, a biological imperative to get as far away from the smell as possible. Chapter 50 The Duskhaven Office of Royal Proclamations was a cavernous hall where echoes died mid-flight, its vaulted ceiling absorbing sound with the same enthusiasm that its staff absorbed joy, the walls lined with scroll cases containing announcements so mundane they made the average tax code read like adventure literature. Head Herald Droneworthy, a man whose voice had been worn to a monotone rasp by decades of announcing edicts no one cared about, stood at his podium each morning to read the day's proclamations to an audience consisting mainly of cobwebs and the occasional lost tourist who immediately regretted the decision to enter. The office's most frequently issued proclamation was Notice of Continued Reign, a document that essentially stated the Queen was still Queen and intended to remain so, a revelation that surprised exactly no one but which tradition demanded be announced weekly just in case someone had missed the previous 600 iterations. The scrolls themselves were works of bureaucratic art, their margins filled with elaborate doodles left by generations of scribes who had long since stopped paying attention to the words they were copying, the official seals pressed into wax with such force that they often came out the other side of the parchment, rendering the documents both illegible and structurally unsound. Each afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, Droneworthy would perform the ritual of the unfurling, a ceremony in which he would dramatically reveal the day's special proclamation, which was invariably just the regular proclamation written in slightly fancier script, before allowing it to roll shut with a disappointing flump that somehow always managed to sound judgmental. The office's sole concession to modernity was a megaphone that had been installed during the reign of Queen Maribel's grandfather and which had never been used because, as Droneworthy often pointed out, if they didn't care when I shouted it, why would they care if I shouted it louder? The proclamation's archive stretched back centuries, its shelves filled with identical tubes containing identical scrolls announcing identical information, a physical manifestation of the definition of insanity as doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results. Chapter 51 The Eldermere Royal Stables housed a collection of carriage horses so perfectly matched in their mediocrity that visitors often suspected they were seeing the same animal in different positions, their coats brushed to a dull sheen that reflected neither light nor personality, their hooves polished to a finish that would last exactly until they took their first step outside. Head groom Currycombe, a man who smelled permanently of liniment and resignation, moved through his daily routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything interesting to happen, his curry brush moving in the same circular patterns it had traced for 37 years across hides that never quite gleamed no matter how much effort he applied. The royal carriage team, theoretically the pride of the stables, pulled their charges with all the enthusiasm of convicts dragging a ball and chain, their pace so precisely calibrated to be unremarkable that the Queen's procession through town always took exactly 42 minutes regardless of distance or occasion, a feat of temporal consistency that would have been impressive if anyone had cared enough to notice. The stable's tack room was a museum of leather goods that had been oiled into immortality, each bridle and harness hanging in exact alignment with its neighbors, the brass fittings polished to a glow that served mainly to highlight how ordinary everything else was. Each evening at sunset, Currycombe would perform his final rounds, checking each stall with a lantern whose flickering light revealed nothing more exciting than horses standing exactly where horses ought to stand, doing exactly what horses ought to do, the quiet chewing and occasional tail swishes providing the only soundtrack to a ritual that had become so ingrained it could have been performed in his sleep, and probably was on some occasions. The stable's most exciting moment in recent memory had been when a mouse had gotten into the feed room in 1397, an event so startling in its deviation from routine that it had been recorded in the stable log as the Great Disturbance, and discussed in hushed tones for weeks afterward. Chapter 52 The Duskhaven Office of Minor Edifices was a cramped chamber where architects went to have their souls slowly crushed under the weight of bureaucratic indifference, its walls lined with plans for buildings so uninspired they made a shoebox look like a cathedral, each draft meticulously corrected for errors no one would ever notice in structures no one would ever remember. Chief Surveyor Plumbline, a man whose posture had permanently adapted to the weight of his own disappointment, spent his days reviewing applications for outhouse repairs and fence extensions, his ruler measuring margins with a precision that bordered on the pathological, his red pencil circling imperfections that existed more in his mind than on the actual blueprints. The office's most frequently requested document was Standard Specifications for Moderately Important Boundary Walls, a 47-page tome that described in excruciating detail how to construct barriers that were neither tall enough to keep anything out nor sturdy enough to last more than a few years, their sole distinguishing feature being an official seal that proved they'd been approved by the proper authorities. The architects working under Plumbline had long since stopped trying to innovate, instead producing variations on the same three designs that had been in use since time immemorial: square buildings with square windows and square doors arranged in square patterns that made the Duskhaven skyline look like a child's first attempt at drawing a city. Each month, the office would hold a design review, where new plans were evaluated based on criteria so obscure that rejection was virtually guaranteed, a ritual that mainly served to remind everyone why no one bothered submitting interesting proposals anymore. The office's sole concession to creativity was a single potted plant that had died sometime in the 1370s but which no one had the heart to remove, its brittle remains still perched on a filing cabinet where they served as a silent testament to the withering effects of institutionalized mediocrity. Chapter 53 The Eldermere Royal Armoury's collection of ceremonial polearms was a study in impractical ornamentation, each glaive and halberd so encrusted with decorative elements that their actual sharpened edges had become purely theoretical, the racks filled with weapons that looked impressive until one realized they'd probably shatter upon first contact with anything more substantial than a particularly stiff breeze. Armourer Pike, a man whose name was both profession and personality, spent his days polishing blades that had never seen combat and likely never would, his whetstone moving in the same practiced arcs it had traced for decades across edges that remained stubbornly dull no matter how much effort he applied. The collection's centerpiece was King Aldric the Ornamental's personal battle standard, a 20-foot monstrosity topped with so much gilded filigree that it required 3 men to carry it and which had famously been abandoned at the first sign of actual conflict during the Battle of Willow's Drift, where it had served mainly to mark the location of the royal retreat. The weapon racks themselves were masterpieces of joinery, their wood polished to a mirror finish that reflected the armory's general aura of futility, each slot labeled with brass plaques that had tarnished to near illegibility through years of neglect interrupted only by the occasional half-hearted polishing. Each spring, Pike would conduct a full inventory of the polearms, a process that mainly involved confirming that yes, all 147 items were still present and accounted for except for the ceremonial pike that kept mysteriously appearing in different locations, a phenomenon Pike attributed to armory gremlins, but which was more likely due to his own failing eyesight and the fact that most of the weapons looked nearly identical after decades of tarnish accumulation. The armory's sole concession to practicality was a single whetstone that had been new when Pike's grandfather had run the place, its surface now worn into a concave dish that sharpened blades unevenly at best, though this didn't stop Pike from applying it with the same care he might give to a weapon that actually stood a chance of being used. Chapter 54 The village of Middle Bottom, so named because it was neither upper nor lower but somehow managed to combine the worst qualities of both, was famous for its annual Ditchwater Festival, an event so profoundly underwhelming that even the ditchwater seemed embarrassed to be associated with it, the entire celebration consisting of villagers standing around a particularly stagnant stretch of canal waiting for something interesting to happen. It never did. The villagers' main industry was ditchwater bottling, a profession that involved skimming the local specialty, a particularly murky liquid that was neither good for drinking nor agriculture but which the villagers insisted had certain therapeutic properties when applied externally. Please don't drink it, into vials that were then shipped to places that had presumably confused their order with something actually useful. Village elder Bogsworth, a man whose complexion suggested he might be part amphibian, presided over monthly meetings where the same 3 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The ditchwater was particularly ditchy this season, it always was. 2. Someone's goat had fallen in again, usually old Tom's goat. And 3. Preparations for the ditchwater festival needed to begin soon, meaning someone should look at last year's plans eventually. The ditchwater festival's main attraction was the ceremonial blessing of the ditch, a centuries-old ritual where the village priest would sprinkle what was essentially slightly cleaner water over what was essentially an open sewer while muttering incantations that even he didn't understand, the whole performance culminating in a collective nod from the villagers that yes, that had probably done something. Visitors to the festival could enjoy such thrilling activities as ditchwater divination, where all predictions inevitably involved more ditchwater painting, using the medium both as pigment and canvas, and the highly anticipated ditchwater tasting, which had been officially discontinued after the Great Purge of 1313 but which still attracted a few daredevils every year. The festival always concluded with the crowning of the ditchwater Duke or Duchess, an honor that mainly involved getting to wear a crown made of reeds that had been growing near the ditch and pretending not to notice the smell. Chapter 55 The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of agricultural treatises filled an entire wing with volumes so dry they made the actual deserts they described seem lush by comparison, the shelves groaning under the weight of countless studies on turnip rotation schedules, soil pH levels in unremarkable fields, and irrigation techniques that had been outdated before the books were even written. Head librarian Tome, a man who had developed a permanent squint from years of reading tiny print by inadequate candlelight, presided over this temple to scholarly tedium with all the enthusiasm of a prisoner counting down his sentence, his fingers leaving faint smudges on pages that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The collection's most celebrated work was On the Various Methods of Determining When a Turnip is Ready for Harvest, a 900-page opus that managed to make even famine sound like a mildly interesting administrative challenge, its dense prose plodding along with the relentless monotony of a plough horse that had been dead for years but hadn't noticed yet. The agriculture wing's sole patron was an elderly farmer who came every market day to read the same chapter about soil acidity before falling asleep in the same overstuffed chair, a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for 32 years and showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Each autumn, the librarians performed the ritual of the dusting, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, wiped with a special cloth that seemed to redistribute dust rather than remove it, and then returned to a slightly different location based on a cataloging system that made sense only to a librarian who had died in 1283, a practice that ensured no one could ever find anything without asking for help, thus guaranteeing at least some human interaction in an otherwise profoundly lonely corner of the library. The agriculture wing's sole concession to modernity was a small sign reading, "Silence please," that had hung slightly crooked since before living memory and which no one had ever thought to straighten, possibly because it was the most interesting thing in the entire department. Chapter 56 The Eldermere Royal Observatory's celestial logs recorded the movements of heavenly bodies with all the excitement of a tax auditor's notebook, each page filled with meticulous notes about stars that had been in the same positions for millennia and planets that followed their predicted paths with depressing reliability, the entire collection bound in volumes so heavy they required their own specially reinforced shelves. Astronomer Starling, a man whose eyes had permanently adapted to peering through telescopes at dim points of light, spent his nights cataloguing phenomena so ordinary they barely qualified as phenomena, his quill scratching across parchment in near-total darkness as he recorded observations that no one would ever read about events that barely qualified as events. The observatory's prized possession was its great telescope, a brass monstrosity so antiquated that its lenses had developed a permanent haze no amount of polishing could remove, its mounting so stiff that adjusting its position required the combined effort of 3 assistants and a block and tackle system that frequently jammed at the least convenient moments. Each new moon, Starling would perform the ritual of lens cleaning, a ceremony that involved exactly 17 wipes with a special chamois cloth that had itself become slightly grimy over the decades, followed by 3 precise drops of optical fluid that did little to improve visibility but which tradition demanded be applied nonetheless. The observatory's most exciting discovery in living memory had been a comet in 1402 that was visible for exactly 3 nights before disappearing forever, an event so fleeting that by the time Starling had finished verifying his notes and prepared an announcement, the celestial visitor had already departed, leaving behind nothing but a few hastily scribbled observations and a vague sense of missed opportunity. The dome's rotation mechanism creaked with the sound of neglected gears, its movement so sluggish that tracking anything across the night sky required starting hours in advance, a fact that explained why most of Starling's logs contained entries like, "Clouds obscured view again," or, "Fell asleep waiting for dome to turn." Chapter 57 The Duskhaven Office of Royal Linens was a cavernous storeroom where generations of bedsheets had gone to fade into obscurity, its shelves stacked with precisely folded rectangles of fabric that had once been white but which had slowly yellowed with age like old teeth, their embroidered crests unraveling at the edges in silent protest against years of indifferent maintenance. Head laundress Starchley, a woman whose hands had been permanently wrinkled from decades of immersion in lukewarm water, presided over this temple to textile mediocrity with all the joy of someone sorting through a dead relative's wardrobe, her measuring stick tapping against shelves as she conducted her weekly inventory of items no one had used in living memory. The collection's prized possession was Queen Maribel the Unremarkable's wedding bedspread, a massive tapestry of silk and gold thread that weighed nearly as much as the Queen herself and which had been folded into the same precise square for 73 years because no one could bear the thought of unfolding something that large ever again. The laundresses spent most of their time repairing minor tears in standard-issue pillowcases, each darn executed with such clinical precision that the repairs were somehow more noticeable than the original damage, their needles flashing in the dim light as they worked their way through piles of mending that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours they spent at it. Twice a year, the staff would perform the great air-out, dragging all the linens into the courtyard where they would flap limply in the breeze for exactly 1 hour before being returned to storage, a ritual that theoretically prevented moth damage but mainly served to remind everyone how yellow everything had become. The office's sole concession to modernity was a single iron that had been imported from Eldermere in 1389 and which was kept under lock and key, not because it was particularly valuable but because no one wanted to be responsible for losing the only implement that could put a semi-respectable crease in the royal napkins. Chapter 58. The Eldermere Royal Gardens hedge maze was a masterpiece of topiary monotony, its towering green walls trimmed with such geometric precision that even the most directionally challenged visitors could navigate it in under 3 minutes, the entire complex laid out in a grid pattern so straightforward it made a checkerboard look like a Rubik's Cube by comparison. Head gardener Snipsley, a man whose shears had worn grooves in his fingers from decades of repetitive motion, moved through the hedges with the mechanical precision of someone performing an autopsy on a particularly boring corpse, his blades flashing as they reduced wayward branches to uniform conformity. The maze's central feature was a sundial that had been placed in such deep shade from surrounding hedges that it hadn't told accurate time since its installation in 1217, its gnomon casting a shadow that moved approximately 3 inches per season whether the sun cooperated or not. Visitors to the maze often remarked on how very green everything was, a compliment that sounded nice until one realized it was the only adjective that could honestly be applied to the entire experience, the hedges having been cultivated to such perfect uniformity that not a single leaf dared to be larger or smaller than its neighbors. Each morning at dawn, Snipsley would make his rounds with a wheelbarrow full of clippings that he collected more out of habit than necessity, his shears snipping at imaginary imperfections as he muttered to himself about the weather and the general decline of horticultural standards. The maze's most exciting moment in recent memory had been when a particularly adventurous hedgehog had wandered in during the summer of 1399, an event so startling in its deviation from routine that Snipsley had recorded it in the garden log as the Great Intrusion, and taken to carrying a net for weeks afterward just in case the creature dared to return. Chapter 59. The village of Nether Sludgewick, so named because even Lower Sludgewick had standards, was famous for its annual Fog Festival, an event so devoid of highlights that even the fog seemed bored by it, the entire celebration consisting of villagers standing around waiting for visibility to improve. It never did. The villagers' main industry was fog collection, a profession that involved holding up specially designed nets to catch moisture that was indistinguishable from regular air moisture, the resulting liquid being bottled and sold as essence of atmosphere to gullible tourists who didn't look at the ingredients too closely. Village elder Mistborn, a man who seemed to be slowly transforming into a cloud himself, presided over monthly meetings where the same 3 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The fog was particularly foggy this season, it always was. 2. Someone's chicken had wandered into the town square again, usually old Tom's chicken. And 3. Preparations for the fog festival needed to begin soon, meaning someone should look at last year's plans eventually. The fog festival's main attraction was the ceremonial unveiling of the Great Fog Bell, a massive brass instrument that had been cast in 1123 and which theoretically produced a deep, resonant tone when struck, though no one could remember the last time it had actually been audible through the thick blanket of mist that perpetually shrouded the village. Visitors to the festival could enjoy such thrilling activities as fog gazing, which looked exactly like regular gazing but with worse visibility, fog tasting, which mainly involved sticking out one's tongue and waiting, and the highly anticipated fog sculpting competition, where all entries inevitably resembled vague blobs because no one could see what they were doing. The festival always concluded with the crowning of the Fog King or Queen, an honor that mainly involved getting to wear a slightly less damp cloak than everyone else and pretending to enjoy it. Chapter 60 The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of legal commentaries filled an entire wing with volumes so dense they seemed to warp gravity around them, their pages filled with analyses of laws that had been obsolete for centuries and interpretations of statutes so obscure even the judges who'd written them couldn't remember what they meant. Head librarian Codify, a man whose spine had permanently curved from years of carrying heavy legal tomes, presided over this temple to jurisprudential tedium with all the enthusiasm of a prisoner counting down his sentence, his fingers leaving faint smudges on pages that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The collection's most celebrated work was On the Various Interpretations of the Third Subsection of the Turnip Taxation Act of 1124, a 1,200-page opus that managed to make even constitutional crises sound like mildly interesting administrative challenges, its dense legalese plodding along with the relentless monotony of a chain gang breaking rocks for no particular reason. The law wing's sole patron was an elderly barrister who came every Thursday to read the same commentary on water rights before falling asleep in the same overstuffed chair, a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for 41 years and showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Each winter, the librarians performed the ritual of the page turning, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, its pages gently fanned to prevent knowledge stagnation, and then returned to a slightly different location based on a cataloging system that made sense only to a librarian who had died in 1297, a practice that ensured no one could ever find anything without asking for help, thus guaranteeing at least some human interaction in an otherwise profoundly lonely corner of the library. The law wing's sole concession to modernity was a small sign reading, "Silence please," that had hung slightly crooked since before living memory and which no one had ever thought to straighten, possibly because it was the most interesting thing in the entire department. The village of Middle Bottom, so named because it was neither upper nor lower but somehow managed to combine the worst qualities of both, was famous for its annual Ditchwater Festival, an event so profoundly underwhelming that even the ditchwater seemed embarrassed to be associated with it, the entire celebration consisting of villagers standing around a particularly stagnant stretch of canal waiting for something interesting to happen. It never did. The villagers' main industry was ditchwater bottling, a profession that involved skimming the local specialty, a particularly murky liquid that was neither good for drinking nor agriculture but which the villagers insisted had certain therapeutic properties when applied externally. Please don't drink it, into vials that were then shipped to places that had presumably confused their order with something actually useful. Village elder Bogsworth, a man whose complexion suggested he might be part amphibian, presided over monthly meetings where the same 3 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The ditchwater was particularly ditchy this season, it always was. 2. Someone's goat had fallen in again, usually old Tom's goat. And 3. Preparations for the Ditchwater Festival needed to begin soon, meaning someone should look at last year's plans eventually. The Ditchwater Festival's main attraction was the ceremonial blessing of the ditch, a centuries-old ritual where the village priest would sprinkle what was essentially slightly cleaner water over what was essentially an open sewer while muttering incantations that even he didn't understand, the whole performance culminating in a collective nod from the villagers that yes, that had probably done something. Visitors to the festival could enjoy such thrilling activities as ditchwater divination, where all predictions inevitably involved more ditchwater painting, using the medium both as pigment and canvas, and the highly anticipated ditchwater tasting, which had been officially discontinued after the Great Purge of 1313 but which still attracted a few daredevils every year. The festival always concluded with the crowning of the Ditchwater Duke or Duchess, an honor that mainly involved getting to wear a crown made of reeds that had been growing near the ditch and pretending not to notice the smell. Chapter 55 The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of agricultural treatises filled an entire wing with volumes so dry they made the actual deserts they described seem lush by comparison, the shelves groaning under the weight of countless studies on turnip rotation schedules, soil pH levels in unremarkable fields, and irrigation techniques that had been outdated before the books were even written. Head librarian Tome, a man who had developed a permanent squint from years of reading tiny print by inadequate candlelight, presided over this temple to scholarly tedium with all the enthusiasm of a prisoner counting down his sentence, his fingers leaving faint smudges on pages that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The collection's most celebrated work was On the Various Methods of Determining When a Turnip is Ready for Harvest, a 900-page opus that managed to make even famine sound like a mildly interesting administrative challenge, its dense prose plodding along with the relentless monotony of a plough horse that had been dead for years but hadn't noticed yet. The agriculture wing's sole patron was an elderly farmer who came every market day to read the same chapter about soil acidity before falling asleep in the same overstuffed chair, a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for 32 years and showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Each autumn, the librarians performed the ritual of the dusting, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, wiped with a special cloth that seemed to redistribute dust rather than remove it, and then returned to a slightly different location based on a cataloguing system that made sense only to a librarian who had died in 1283, a practice that ensured no one could ever find anything without asking for help, thus guaranteeing at least some human interaction in an otherwise profoundly lonely corner of the library. The agriculture wing's sole concession to modernity was a small sign reading, "Silence please," that had hung slightly crooked since before living memory and which no one had ever thought to straighten, possibly because it was the most interesting thing in the entire department. Chapter 56 The Eldermere Royal Observatory's celestial logs recorded the movements of heavenly bodies with all the excitement of a tax auditor's notebook, each page filled with meticulous notes about stars that had been in the same positions for millennia and planets that followed their predicted paths with depressing reliability, the entire collection bound in volumes so heavy they required their own specially reinforced shelves. Astronomer Starling, a man whose eyes had permanently adapted to peering through telescopes at dim points of light, spent his nights cataloguing phenomena so ordinary they barely qualified as phenomena, his quill scratching across parchment in near-total darkness as he recorded observations that no one would ever read about events that barely qualified as events. The observatory's prized possession was its great telescope, a brass monstrosity so antiquated that its lenses had developed a permanent haze no amount of polishing could remove, its mounting so stiff that adjusting its position required the combined effort of 3 assistants and a block and tackle system that frequently jammed at the least convenient moments. Each new moon, Starling would perform the ritual of lens cleaning, a ceremony that involved exactly 17 wipes with a special chamois cloth that had itself become slightly grimy over the decades, followed by 3 precise drops of optical fluid that did little to improve visibility but which tradition demanded be applied nonetheless. The observatory's most exciting discovery in living memory had been a comet in 1402 that was visible for exactly 3 nights before disappearing forever, an event so fleeting that by the time Starling had finished verifying his notes and prepared an announcement, the celestial visitor had already departed, leaving behind nothing but a few hastily scribbled observations and a vague sense of missed opportunity. The dome's rotation mechanism creaked with the sound of neglected gears, its movement so sluggish that tracking anything across the night sky required starting hours in advance, a fact that explained why most of Starling's logs contained entries like, "Clouds obscured view again," or, "Fell asleep waiting for dome to turn." Chapter 57 The Duskhaven Office of Royal Linens was a cavernous storeroom where generations of bedsheets had gone to fade into obscurity, its shelves stacked with precisely folded rectangles of fabric that had once been white but which had slowly yellowed with age like old teeth, their embroidered crests unraveling at the edges in silent protest against years of indifferent maintenance. Head laundress Starchley, a woman whose hands had been permanently wrinkled from decades of immersion in lukewarm water, presided over this temple to textile mediocrity with all the joy of someone sorting through a dead relative's wardrobe, her measuring stick tapping against shelves as she conducted her weekly inventory of items no one had used in living memory. The collection's prized possession was Queen Maribel the Unremarkable's wedding bedspread, a massive tapestry of silk and gold thread that weighed nearly as much as the Queen herself and which had been folded into the same precise square for 73 years because no one could bear the thought of unfolding something that large ever again. The laundresses spent most of their time repairing minor tears in standard issue pillowcases, each darn executed with such clinical precision that the repairs were somehow more noticeable than the original damage, their needles flashing in the dim light as they worked their way through piles of mending that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours they spent at it. Twice a year, the staff would perform the great air out, dragging all the linens into the courtyard where they would flap limply in the breeze for exactly 1 hour before being returned to storage, a ritual that theoretically prevented moth damage but mainly served to remind everyone how yellow everything had become. The office's sole concession to modernity was a single iron that had been imported from Eldermere in 1389 and which was kept under lock and key, not because it was particularly valuable but because no one wanted to be responsible for losing the only implement that could put a semi-respectable crease in the royal napkins. Chapter 58. The Eldermere Royal Gardens hedge maze was a masterpiece of topiary monotony, its towering green walls trimmed with such geometric precision that even the most directionally challenged visitors could navigate it in under 3 minutes, the entire complex laid out in a grid pattern so straightforward it made a checkerboard look like a Rubik's Cube by comparison. Head gardener Snipsley, a man whose shears had worn grooves in his fingers from decades of repetitive motion, moved through the hedges with the mechanical precision of someone performing an autopsy on a particularly boring corpse, his blades flashing as they reduced wayward branches to uniform conformity. The maze's central feature was a sundial that had been placed in such deep shade from surrounding hedges that it hadn't told accurate time since its installation in 1217, its gnomon casting a shadow that moved approximately 3 inches per season whether the sun cooperated or not. Visitors to the maze often remarked on how very green everything was, a compliment that sounded nice until one realized it was the only adjective that could honestly be applied to the entire experience, the hedges having been cultivated to such perfect uniformity that not a single leaf dared to be larger or smaller than its neighbors. Each morning at dawn, Snipsley would make his rounds with a wheelbarrow full of clippings that he collected more out of habit than necessity, his shears snipping at imaginary imperfections as he muttered to himself about the weather and the general decline of horticultural standards. The maze's most exciting moment in recent memory had been when a particularly adventurous hedgehog had wandered in during the summer of 1399, an event so startling in its deviation from routine that Snipsley had recorded it in the garden loggers, The Great Intrusion, and taken to carrying a net for weeks afterward just in case the creature dared to return. Chapter 59. The village of Nether Sludgewick, so named because even Lower Sludgewick had standards, was famous for its annual Fog Festival, an event so devoid of highlights that even the fog seemed bored by it, the entire celebration consisting of villagers standing around waiting for visibility to improve. It never did. The villagers' main industry was fog collection, a profession that involved holding up specially designed nets to catch moisture that was indistinguishable from regular air moisture, the resulting liquid being bottled and sold as essence of atmosphere to gullible tourists who didn't look at the ingredients too closely. Village elder Mistborn, a man who seemed to be slowly transforming into a cloud himself, presided over monthly meetings where the same 3 topics were discussed in rotating order. 1. The fog was particularly foggy this season, it always was. 2. Someone's chicken had wandered into the town square again, usually Old Tom's chicken. And 3. Preparations for the fog festival needed to begin soon, meaning someone should look at last year's plans eventually. The fog festival's main attraction was the ceremonial unveiling of the Great Fog Bell, a massive brass instrument that had been cast in 1123 and which theoretically produced a deep, resonant tone when struck, though no one could remember the last time it had actually been audible through the thick blanket of mist that perpetually shrouded the village. Visitors to the festival could enjoy such thrilling activities as fog gazing, which looked exactly like regular gazing but with worse visibility, fog tasting, which mainly involved sticking out one's tongue and waiting, and the highly anticipated fog sculpting competition, where all entries inevitably resembled vague blobs because no one could see what they were doing. The festival always concluded with the crowning of the Fog King or Queen, an honor that mainly involved getting to wear a slightly less damp cloak than everyone else and pretending to enjoy it. Chapter 60. The Duskhaven Royal Library's collection of legal commentaries filled an entire wing with volumes so dense they seemed to warp gravity around them, their pages filled with analyses of laws that had been obsolete for centuries and interpretations of statutes so obscure even the judges who'd written them couldn't remember what they meant. Head librarian Codify, a man whose spine had permanently curved from years of carrying heavy legal tomes, presided over this temple to jurisprudential tedium with all the enthusiasm of a prisoner counting down his sentence, his fingers leaving faint smudges on pages that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The collection's most celebrated work was on the various interpretations of the third subsection of the Turnip Taxation Act of 1124, a 1,200-page opus that managed to make even constitutional crises sound like mildly interesting administrative challenges, its dense legalese plodding along with the relentless monotony of a chain gang breaking rocks for no particular reason. The Law Wing's sole patron was an elderly barrister who came every Thursday to read the same commentary on water rights before falling asleep in the same overstuffed chair, a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for 41 years and showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Each winter, the librarians performed the ritual of the page turning, a week-long event where every volume was removed from its shelf, its pages gently fanned to prevent knowledge stagnation, and then returned to a slightly different location based on a cataloging system that made sense only to a librarian who had died in 1297, a practice that ensured no one could ever find anything without asking for help, thus guaranteeing at least some human interaction in an otherwise profoundly lonely corner of the library. The Law Wing's sole concession to modernity was a small sign reading, "Silence please," that had hung slightly crooked since before living memory and which no one had ever thought to straighten, possibly because it was the most interesting thing in the entire department.